Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am joined today by Andrew Hronich, who I just got the pronunciation. Hopefully that was correct. Hronich. There's three different syllables. Hronich, right?
That's right.
So, excellent. Well, first of all, some people are asking why I'm having a heretic back on the show. So maybe we want to address that at the beginning. Andrew is a universalist. So that may turn off a whole lot of our audience, but you don't actually have to believe in universalism to get a whole lot of out today's show. So I did want to kind of make that point at the beginning. I mean, you're going to be drawing on sources that are obviously orthodox for the majority of the show today, right?
There's not actually a single universalist I'm drawing on in this, so yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, I should also mention what the video actually today, what we're talking about, and what we are talking about. There was a recent video. His name is Dustin over at Non-Alchemist. He is an atheist YouTuber. I actually did a debate with him not too long ago that premiered on the channel. I think it was back in October. I can't remember the exact date, but we were talking about the logical problem of evil, and that is a topic that he talks about on his channel a lot. So he put out a video about 3 weeks ago. It's titled Hidden Problems for Christianity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to respond to at least one of those problems, which is the first portion of he basically kind of lays out two different problems. The second problem that he goes through, we already kind of debated in our back and forth in our debates. And he didn't really seem to make a whole lot of progress on in responding to the things that I said during that debate in this video. So there's not really much to respond to here in that second part. So we're going to be addressing the first part, which is kind of if you looked at the thumbnail and the title of this video, he kind of argues from the fact that babies, if they go to heaven, then that provides some sort of response objection to the idea that these various theodicies like free will or soul building are as valuable as theists claim that they are. So he says that if heaven is populated by mostly, people that haven't had a chance to go through the sorts of experiences required for soul building on earth, if most people in heaven haven't had that chance, that's surprising given the value of, soul building itself, which is what theists often claim when the problem of evil gets raised. Is the reason why there's so much suffering in the world is because there are these great goods that can obtain, but they require suffering. And so that's kind of his response, is that heaven seems kind of weird. It's unexpected that heaven would have so many people that didn't have that chance. And so that's a basic rundown of what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to break up this first portion of his video in about 4 different clips, and we're going to get responses from Andrew, and I'll add whatever I have to say on that clip on top of what Andrew has to say. But Andrew's going to be the star in today's show. So, Andrew, well, first of all, it's great to have you back on the show. We did talk about universalism last time you were here, but it's great to have you on to just do a sort of standard, apologetics type video together. So I'm happy to be working with you.
I can dabble with the light side and the dark side of the force. There is balance.
Yeah. Well, and you were the one actually that put this video on my radar. I hadn't even, I can't remember if I saw it on my YouTube feed or not, but you were like, hey, this video, I might actually be interested in giving some sort of response to it. So, yeah, that's why we're here. So thanks for putting it on my radar. And, actually, you know what? I should have had this video already pulled up, because this type of objection, that the heaven objection, that heaven is populated by so many people. One way that this objection has been put in the past is why didn't God just start everyone out in heaven? Why, if heaven is so great, why not just start everyone there? And so I actually have a video on that I produced 3 or 4 years ago. And you sent me this video and you're like, hey, this is one of the main problems that he raises. And I was like, I kind of talked about that 4 or 5 years ago. This is my basic view of that. And I will kind of reiterate some of the things that I say in that video, but I'm going to build on them as we go throughout the show. So I'm excited. Do you have any thoughts before we get into the review here of this video?
Yeah, just a few. So first of all, he says that one of the points of this video is to show that it is not a good thing to have inconsistencies in your beliefs. And that's not anything that the Christian should go, whoa, that's surprising. I thought I thought that was totally okay. And I think that he is right, is that this does tend to be an inconsistency that at least many Baptists who I grew up around did have. And it was a problem. I remember as a little kid thinking, wait a minute, if you need a free will decision in order to be saved, then what happens to deceased infants? And my mother had a miscarriage when I was very young. And that always just stayed with me. And I wondered, where is that child now? Will I see that child again? And it wasn't really comforting to hear the Augustinians just trance along and say, "Oh yeah, she's burning in hell right now." So that got me exploring alternative options that seemed to be more appealing to the conscience and to that being that which none greater can be conceived.
Yeah, one of the points that he makes in this video, and I could just leave it to talk about that when we get to it, but he makes the point that Christians need to like be thinking about these issues. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're going to see in the video today is that Christians have thought about these issues quite a bit. And so, yeah, a little bit of irony there.
Yeah, I'm at the located next to the second largest theological library in the world. And so whenever I have someone said, man, Christians never thought about this, I'm like, okay, I actually work at the library. Can I just take you to a certain section? You'll find several hundred books on that topic.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and start. Let's at least play the first clip. I think it's from like 205 to 206 or 306, and I've got it linked. The whole video, if you guys want to watch it, I've got it linked in the description of the video. If you guys want to go check it out for yourselves, we're just gonna play again the first part of the video, which is like his first hidden problem for Christianity. One last thing. So I mentioned this in the past few live streams, but we have a new thing that we're doing where we're taking super chats as they come in. So if you have a super chat, you'd like to help support the ministry or just send in a question or comment or whatever else, and you want to send it as a super chat, we'll kind of pause where we're at in the video. We'll address it. We'll talk about it as a sort of thank you for sending in your super chat. So something a little bit different that we're doing. So if you want to do that or send it, you obviously don't have to do any of that, but just want to let you guys know that that's a change in our format. So, all right, let's get onto the video. Here we go. The first clip is about a minute long. Let's go.
What happens when a baby dies? That's a bit of an abrupt transition, I guess. But really, what happens? Among Christians, the answers diverge. Some claim that we can't know that they don't wake up to eternal conscious torment. Yes, I can prove that. The Reformed tradition holds that, quote, elect infants dying in infancy are regenerated and saved by Christ through the Spirit, who worketh when and where and how he pleaseth, unquote. This clearly means what it appears to mean. As Chad Van Dixhorn, an expert on the minutes of the Westminster Assembly, writes, quote, often there is a tendency to drop the qualifying word elect from the word infants, with the suggestion that all babies go to heaven. The scriptures do not allow us to draw this conclusion. Apparent innocence does not rise to the height of an eternal entitlement. Second, the confession is not saying that infants and the mentally handicapped are saved or elected because they are infants or because they are handicapped.
All right. So I will admit I am myself not Reformed, but at the same time, I like to examine the source material, right, and have correct beliefs about alternative views. And I just think he's simply wrong. For many people who adhere to the Westminster Confession of Faith, this just wasn't clear to them. So there were some people. I have a book right here. It's an old book by J.V. Stevens. It's called Elect Infants, in which he really breaks down the Westminster Confession of Faith and what it has to say on this particular statement. So for one thing, there were some people who did claim that elect infants dying in infancy had reference to all those who die in infancy. So they didn't have this idea that it just referred to some infants who died in infancy, but that it covered them all. That a sign of your election was a sign that you died in infancy, right? But he is right in that there were others, though, who disagreed. That's to my point, that this just wasn't clear for many people. So in 1892, the PCUSA, which is the largest Presbyterian denomination, proposed to actually change the reading of this text to, quote, infants dying in infancy and all other persons not guilty of actual transgression are included in the election of grace and are regenerated and saved by Christ through the Spirit who worketh when and where and how he pleaseth. So that's what the PCUSA did want to change this statement to. So it just wasn't clear for many people what the statement was trying to imply. The problem was that when the PCUSA in 1892 attempted to change the statement, that you needed a 2/3 majority in order to do it, and the vote was 105 to 68, so it didn't go through. The statement was not amended. But then you have the United Presbyterian Church of Scotland in its Declaratory Act. It affirmed that, quote, in accepting the standards, it is not required to hold that any who die in infancy are lost, end quote. The Declaratory Act of the Free Church of Scotland in Section 3 says, quote, with some caution, it affirms that, quote, while the gospel is the ordinary means of salvation for those to whom it is made known, yet it does not follow, nor is the confession to be held as teaching that any who would die in infancy are lost, end quote. The Presbyterian Church of England omits from its new creed altogether any mention of the elect infants. So these are just some prominent examples of Presbyterians who they either do not see that portion of the Westminster Confession of Faith as saying that only some infants are elect, they see it as obtaining to all infants, or there are alternative Presbyterian denominations who they do attempt to amend the statement. But just to pretend like this is the Reformed view is a joke, okay? The Reformed tradition is quite diverse. So that's just simply wrong.
And you're also saying this as like someone who, again, that doesn't accept this view. You want to get it accurate, right? You want to get their view at least be charitable toward them.
Oh God, I'm not a Calvinist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think God is either. But I think that you need to get these things right, and just attempting to say and cite one scholar that the Westminster Confession of Faith was clearly stating this is just simply wrong.
Yeah, it makes me wonder why he included this section at all. Because he does eventually like say, and we'll get to that clip in just a little bit, but he does eventually say that like there's a lot of Christians who don't have this view, right? And so that's really what it's going to boil down to in his mind, like this objection. Even if you accept that babies go to heaven, then his problem is what supposedly follows. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea is a smear campaign, it seems, against the Reformed tradition, which, again, I'm not Reformed, but just simply false. There's this common idea that all Reformed people believe that most people who've ever lived will be damned. And that's just incorrect. If you look at Charles Hodge, if you look at B.B. Warfield, if you look at Douglas Wilson, if you look at Paul Helm, they all believe the vast majority of mankind will be saved. And this is how they do it. Every time when you see a Calvinist say the vast majority of humans will be saved, all right, you should know immediately what they're going to say next. If they're going to say they believe in the millennium, right? If they're like a post-millennialist, they believe that tons and tons of people are going to be saved in that time period. And then they believe that all infants who die are also saved. So my pastor back home, for example, is a Calvinist who that's exactly what he believes, is that he believes the vast majority of people will be saved because he believes that all infants who die are going to be saved. So it's just false to say that all Calvinists believe that the vast majority will be damned. That's just not true. I would also add, so Ulrich Zwingli is another individual who would be put into the Reformed tradition by most folks. And he argued that God can elect whomsoever he wills, and that all children of Christian parents are among the elect, right? So that would be an example of what he's saying, is that you seem to have some people who think that only some are elect, that not all infants are elect. So that's true. You will have some figures like Zwingli in that regards, but then you have others like B.B. Warfield and Charles Hodge who would disagree. So again, it's just not clear.
Yeah, well, we actually had a super chat come in, so let's go ahead and address that one. As I mentioned, we will be taking these throughout the stream. So Truth Seeker says, what is the most reliable epistemological tool for identifying and investigating supernatural claims? Just a little bit off topic, but to answer the question, I would say the most reliable epistemological tool would just be, standard stuff: induction, abduction, inference to the best explanation, Bayesianism, like Bayes' theorem, like standard stuff. Like I agree with philosopher Trent Doherty, who thinks that basically the correct approach, the correct epistemology for pretty much every category of rational inquiry is going to be something like Bayes' theorem, where you're going to be looking at different alternative possibilities, alternative hypotheses, and then comparing them relative to the evidence. And that seems like a pretty good thing to do. So that's basically the way that I would approach it. Especially if you're looking for a quote unquote tool for identifying and investigating the supernatural. So that's my response. Andrew, any thoughts on that one?
Absolutely none, because it caught me completely off guard. But then once I started to register, yeah, I agree more or less with you. So I wouldn't add anything there. But to my point, I do want to add two more figures just to drive home that the Reformed tradition does
Okay.
not
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah, feel
believe
free.
that not all infants are saved. That there's only some infants who are elect. So you have another figure. You have Robert Lightner, who he said, "quote I do not believe that for a moment the idea that only some infants are elect and not all. It impugns the very character of God to believe such a thing." Those are very strong words from a Reformed individual. Neil Punt also thought that all people were saved except those who willfully and ultimately rejected God. And he said, well, infants don't willfully and ultimately reject God, therefore infants are saved. So again, this idea that, well, you got to hold this certain reading of the Westminster Confession of Faith or you're not Reformed. Okay, I'm at a Presbyterian school. That is simply not the view that is held here. So I just want to make that clear.
I think you have made it clear. So let's move on to the next clip. Let's go to let me pull up my scene here. Here we go.
Unquote. It follows that, quote, if one were to be elect on the basis of foreseen faith or obedience, what parents could have hope for their dying baby or for their aging but mentally inhibited child? Unquote. Don't miss what he is saying here. The reason that election is good news for many Christians is because without it, it is right for children dying in infancy to wake up for the first time to eternal conscious torment. To wake up to millions and millions of unending ages of the omnipotent floodgates of the fierce wrath of God that is vastly disproportionate to an individual's strength to bear. After all, the only precedent in the Reformed tradition is to offer hope to Christian parents that their children dying in infancy are part of the elect group of infants. See the Canons of Dort, the first main point of doctrine, Article 17.
Yeah, so I already touched on a lot of this. That's just so false, okay? Like, I was reading Richard Mao the other day, who he wrote a really interesting book about Calvinism in the Las Vegas airport. He is a well-known Reformed figure. He does not take that view. Most Calvinists that I know do not take that view. Like I said before, when the infant dies, they will often say its death is a sign of its election. Okay, with most Reformed people, they mean not all. All right, so like a prominent one today, at least amongst the Apologetics group, is someone like Chris State. He's Reformed. He doesn't take that view, but a lot of other people do. Now, I want to read what the Canons of Dort say because it might be interesting to some folks. He is right on that point for once. It says, quote, godly parents ought not to doubt the election and salvation of their children, whom it pleases God to call out of this life in their infancy. It adds, quote, that there is an election and reprobation of infants, no less than of adults. We cannot deny in the face of God, who loves and hates unborn children. Yeah, that is quite astonishingly harsh, okay, the Canons of Dort. So he is right in regards to the Canons of Dort that there does seem to be this view that there are some infants who are elected to salvation and some infants who are elected onto damnation, but that is just not the view of a lot of Reformed folks. So to say, I don't know, it sounds almost like pitting Reformed people as Catholic. Like Reformed people believe that these creeds and confessions are infallible. If you read someone like Oliver Crisp, he says, for sure, Reformed creeds and confessions are authoritative readings of Scripture, but they're not infallible. They're a witness to that which is infallible. And so, someone like Karl Barth, for crying out loud, who's a rock star amongst many Reformed individuals, granted, not all Reformed individuals like Karl Barth, wouldn't take such a view. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I would just encourage people, if you're really interested in the Reformed view, right, as it's developed over the years regarding election, here's a resource by B.B. Warfield. It's called The Development of the Doctrine of Infant Salvation, okay? And you would just know that there is definitely a precedent for the idea within Reformed circles that all infants who die are elect. So I'll just leave it there.
Yep, let's leave that one there. Let's move on to the next clip. This might be a really short video, actually. Let's get this next one.
Even if you don't think God actually does that, if your system entails that it would be fair if he did, your ideas are bad, and you should feel bad. But if you don't have unhinged views like that as a Christian, you probably think all babies go to heaven when they die. They wake up in the presence of infinite divine love and are welcomed into eternal bliss. This is a comforting thought, and maybe we should even extend this to zygotes, right? An uncountable number of you extend personhood to zygotes for no good reason, so why not? Anyway, if you do, have you not seen how this creates a lot of trouble for your views? Think about how many pregnancies don't go to term for one reason or another. The numbers are actually staggering. Somewhere around half of fertilized eggs don't go to term. Add to that the massive number of young children who have died throughout evolutionary history, and heaven is going to be populated mostly by people, quote, who never develop personalities, have no memories, know nothing of love or loss or failure or ecstasy or regret or even redemption, and will have no experience of this life whatsoever, unquote. But I'm sure God will zap all those people to the mature age of 30, right? Believe it.
Okay, yeah. So he actually, this is probably the best clip that I found from the video. He does make a lot of good points in here. So I don't know how familiar your audience is with someone like Norman Geisler, but he does at times make shocking statements. So Norman Geisler once said that, quote, high infant mortality rates in the overwhelmingly non-Christian third world have a salvific design. He takes his elect from those who are under the age of accountability in countries where if they had grown up, they wouldn't have heard the gospel and they would have wanted to hear it, end quote. Right. So my pastor back home, he had a similar view. It's the idea that God's got the system rigged, that the vast majority of people across all existence have died in infancy. In fact, there was a church father, I believe it was Gregory of Nyssa, who said that imagine life as a bunch and every individual soul as like a little boat, right? It's going to cross over the sea. Only a very few would reach the other side because in the ancient world, so many children died in a state of infancy. So many, the vast majority. So he's absolutely right. The vast majority of persons thus far have not reached the age of what we would consider to be maturity in most cases. And so what do you do with that? Well, so there have been some shocking statements by Christians. I just read one from Norman Geisler. You'll find others who, Millard Erickson, if you're familiar with him, he's another Reformed thinker, he has the worry that this could lead, the idea that if there is an age accountability and infants don't reach it, it could mean that infanticide is the best form of evangelism. It's 100% guaranteed success. And so there is a rainbow in all the abortions that goes on because these babies go straight to heaven. I'm not kidding you. I've met some of those Christians who think this is the best form of evangelism. Especially, you'll find accounts. I read one from a mother who she went to a service one time, and the pastor was talking about hell. And she had about 6 children back home, and she thought it was so horrible. And the pastor stressed that once you get to the age of accountability, it's all over. And so she went home and she drowned all 6 of her kids. She drowned all 6 of them. And this has happened, events like this, repeatedly, where Christians who have been taught the age of accountability, especially parents, they think, I need to kill my child because I don't want them to go to such a place. I don't want to risk the possibility that they'll go there. So this actually is an interesting point. Now, the problem is that Christians are aware of this, and they have been thinking about this for a very long time. So I told you, Cameron, that I was going to bring up a lot of Catholic thinkers because, especially in the Catholic tradition, you have this idea called final option theory, right? So it's credited to people like Karl Rahner. You even find among Protestants like J. Oliver Boswell, I think. Good resource if you want to know more about the final option theory is John Sanders' book, No Other Name, and Terence Thiessen's book, Who Can Be Saved? Now, this is really interesting, this view. Maybe it goes back to Uhtred, who a lot of people might not be familiar with. Maybe it goes back before him. But this is kind of how the idea works, is that it implies universal evangelization when every individual person at the moment of death perceive God, right, in a way that is previously unhindered. So the soul is awakened for the first time, and the soul is made aware of God and is able to choose God in a way that it hasn't before. Now, there's different ways of parsing that out. So some people say that you, like Terence Thiessen, is he says that in that moment, your choice is going to be consistent with the choices that you previously made. All right. So this could extend beyond infants. So say, for example, you're not an inclusivist. You're like you think that Karl Rahner's view is disgusting. Okay, which there were a lot of Catholic thinkers who thought it was extremely offensive. The idea of anonymous Christian. Oh yeah, you Buddhist. You claim to be a Buddhist, but you're really an anonymous Christian. So some people didn't like that idea. So they rather like the final option theory, because the final option theory had the advantage that you didn't need to talk about this baptism with desire. You didn't need to talk about this idea of anonymous Christian. You didn't need to add all these extra rings. You could just say that at the moment of death, this is what happens. So some people said at the moment of death, you're going to be choosing in a consistent manner to the way that your choices have been before. But then the question is, well, what choices have infants made exactly, right? How could they be said to be choosing consistently if they haven't really made any moral decisions, right? That's the obvious question. So then some people have posited, well, their action may be like the angels. So there's this common view, especially among Catholic circles, that angels, right? I've seen people like Peter Kreeft say that there was never such a thing as a fall, okay? Because a fall implies that you were at a certain state and that you fell from that state. But he said that's not what happens with the angels. What happens with the angels is in a single moment, right? They are made aware of God to the extent that they're capable of, and they make their choice. And that choice, once it's made, is irreversible, it's unchangeable, right? The trajectory that they now have made. And so just like that, that could be what happens to infants, is that infants at the moment of death, God is presented before them. So for those who are worried about post-mortem repentance, well, guess what? You're in luck, because this is not after death. This is at the moment of death. Now, how long is this moment? Well, that's an interesting question. So there's a novel that I keep on hearing about, or maybe it's a short story, where there's this guy, I don't know if you ever heard of it. He's about to be hung, okay? And in the story, it's really interesting. The rope snaps and he runs away and has a giant escapade. And it turns out, when you get to the end of the story, that actually this was all happening in his head prior to his hanging. The rope never actually snapped. The guy gets hung. He's killed. But this all happened in that short span of time. And so there is a concept that's called hypertime. Now, if you're of the opinion that you think that hypertime is a possibility, then this moment of death can be an extended, quote unquote, period of time, that it can be almost like years of opportunity for this individual. So that if you're uncomfortable with the idea of post-mortem repentance, you can get around that through this theory. And lots of people have embraced this theory. I'm seeing more and more people coming to acknowledge that this theory has plausibility. You have somebody like James Bealby, who in his recent book, Post-Mortem Opportunity, acknowledges that this theory could account for many of the things that he is trying to put forth in the idea of post-mortem repentance. And I think he's right. So, yeah, it's almost so. There is the concern that you could have from people called Jansenists, all right? Who they were a movement within Catholic circles who was often deemed Calvinistic. People did not like the Jansenists, especially the Jesuits. So the Jansenists had this worry of the doctrine of limbo, for example, which many people, if they're understanding final option theory, they're saying that kind of sounds like limbo. So this goes all the way back to Augustine. And so you had someone like Pelagius, who Pelagius said, when it comes to infants, right, I know where they're not. They're not in hell. But where are they? I don't know, right? He just knew where they were, but he didn't know where he knew where they weren't, but he didn't know where they were. And so over time, he and his followers came to develop this idea of this middle ground between eternal life and eternal punishment. Now, Augustine didn't like that. And I remember thinking, before I ever saw his reasoning for why he didn't like that, I said, now, what could be an explanation for why he doesn't like this middle road? And it immediately came to me. It's Matthew 25:46, where it talks about the sheep and goats. And sure enough, that's exactly what Augustine and his followers cite. They say there is no middle ground. There's either heaven or hell, eternal punishment, or eternal life. That's it. Right. So you had later Catholic theologians like Peter Lombard in the 12th century, who decided to distinguish between pains of damnation and pains of sense. And he came to the idea that unbaptized infants, but they experience only pains of damnation, not pains of sense, okay? So the word limbo itself means fringe, okay? So it's on the fringe, not of heaven, but on the fringe of hell. And so the infants are punished for original sin, which implies an inherited guilt, in the sense only that they do not, they had the loss of the beatific vision and of the joy that is had by the saints in union with God. But they don't have the same punishment as somebody like Adolf Hitler, right? They don't have pains of sense. So this was later defended by people like Thomas Aquinas. This was later defended by Robert Bellarmine, Protestants did not like this. John Calvin did not like this. John Wycliffe certainly did not like this. So you had a lot of pushback. But at least in Catholic circles, this was a prominent idea, is that infants are in limbo in the sense that they are experiencing hell only in pains of loss, but not in pains of sense. Not all Catholics agreed on this, but there were certainly some, right? So that was a common idea. Then the whole idea, though, was that later on was the worry that you had from people like Kevin Timpe, who I don't know if you know who that is, but he's a prominent theologian alive today. And he decided that, well, maybe limbo could be conceived not necessarily as a permanent location, as some Catholic theologians thought, but as a temporary one. So limbo could be a space where the mentally handicapped and infants could develop cognitively in other regards until they came to the point where they could make such a decision. Now, the similarities between that and the final option theory, I think, are really profound, if you're following. So you have Kevin Timpe who says, yeah, limbo, I don't think that limbo is permanent, or at least he says there's this idea that it could not be permanent, but that it could be temporary. And the final option theory, that's exactly what it's saying. And so I think that you could marry the two together, and then you have this idea that everybody in the end is universally evangelized, not just infants, but especially infants. And that just as your grandfather, when your grandfather dies and he had been in a state of amnesia and his faculties had decreased, but at the moment of death, God increases his faculties. I don't see any problem with God increasing the faculties of the infants at death. So this is a pretty Catholic response, but I don't see any problem with Protestants, such as John Sanders and James Bilby and others adopting it as well.
So this final option theory, you say it's completely compatible with Catholic teaching. I actually had Father Hronich on talking about universalism. He gave some objections to universalism, but we did discuss whether or not it's actually compatible. Universalism is sort of logically compatible with Catholic teaching, and a lot of philosophers think that it is, that it's at least, even if you don't think that it's probable that everyone will be saved, you can nevertheless think that, well, there's at least a consistency between the two. Logically speaking. And this would offer one such route. And Father Hronich and I actually discussed this as well. We didn't call it final option theory, but it was basically at the moment of death, like if there is another opportunity at that moment. And as you say, like that moment could be as long or as short as you might need. There's a lot of precedent in the Bible for drawing out moments of time, as one day is as 1,000 for the Lord. And even in dreams, I think only last a few minutes, but in our minds, it seems like hours, right? Something like that could, I don't know, plausibly be taking place. So yeah, I was looking at the live chat as you were kind of going through this theory, and some people were saying that you're doing way too much speculating. Like there's just, how do you know any of this stuff? And what I was going to say, and sort of to try to defend you or this idea a little bit, is just to say, so if you think that there's something seriously wrong with, God, if you think that the problem of the unevangelized is a really serious problem, okay, so for people who have never heard the gospel, like, what do you do with that person? Are they just damned to hell? Like, what happens? And if you think that it's only right and fitting for a loving being to evangelize everyone, then you might be motivated. You might have some motivation to think that some theory like this is true, because it sort of makes the two make sense. Like the fact that there are people who have never heard the gospel, but then also the fact that God wants everyone to hear the gospel. This is one possible solution. So it might give you some motivation to think that it does actually hold in the actual world. So that might be one way to motivate this theory beyond just like sort of, speculation, which it sort of is. I mean, when we're talking about the afterlife and stuff, like we do have to speculate.
Yeah. So a few things. So something I could say, because I talked to my professor, Dale Allison, about this, who I don't know if your listeners know who that is, but he's an intellectual hero of mine.
I'm sure
he's very
familiar,
familiar with. Okay, he's very familiar with NDEs, right? Near-death experiences. And the interesting thing that you'll find in a lot of these near-death experiences is that people are often presented with choices, right? Do I continue on or do I not, right? So there's that choice that occurs to them in that moment. It's almost like if you ever watched Harry Potter, The Deathly Hallows, where Harry Potter has that moment where Dumbledore, right, he approaches them, and that moment is, I guess it would be a near-death experience, and Dumbledore tells him, hey, you can board a train, it will take you on, or you can go back, right? And Harry has that option. And so I've talked to several philosophers where I presented this to them, and they said that they think that looking at near-death experiences might shine light on this, that you have something very similar to this. Now, as far as the idea, well, that's not in Scripture. Okay, this is inferential. I'll show you how. So there's 5 premises that are put together that kind of lead towards this. So premise 1, a person's destiny is sealed at death, so there is no post-mortem opportunity for conversion. Okay, this is according to many Catholics and many Protestants, right? So no post-mortem opportunity of repentance. Premise 2, Jesus Christ is the only Savior, and there is no saving faith apart from knowledge of Jesus' life and the Trinity. Premise 3, salvation is defined as personal fellowship with Jesus Christ. Premise 4, Jesus died for all people, and God desires the salvation of all people. Premise 5, an act of faith is necessary for salvation. Okay? So you put all that together, and you deny post-mortem repentance, then this is one of the best ways to reconcile those inferences, right? So that's how a lot of theology is done. It's done from inferences. You have someone like Peter Kreeft, who's a Catholic philosopher, who he says the doctrine of purgatory, for example. If you read a lot of good Roman Catholic scholars, they'll say they won't even try to find in some obscure verse in Corinthians. They'll say, no, it is not explicitly there, but you can derive it inferentially from other statements that the Bible offers. And I think that's a pretty great argument. One other thing to add is there could be an alternative view. Someone could push back like Jerry Walls, and he talks about this in the logic of eternal transformation, right? And it's almost like he presents the idea that these infants go to purgatory, but they could go and make their decision there. I don't like that at all. And here's the reason. What sins do they have to be purged from exactly?
Yeah.
What actual sins do they have to be purged from? They don't have any. So I don't think that purgatory is the place where this happens. I think after they make their decision, they can go there.
So just a little pushback on that. So I have some very small children. Well, they're not as small right now. We have one on the way actually. So she'll be here very soon. But man, kids can be bad from very early on. You'd be surprised how early on they start to do like bad things, and you're like, I told you not to do that, and you're doing it, But yeah, no, I but obviously, like, so for someone who hasn't even been born, like that's not going to be true for that individual. But
actually, you could have even better pushback, which I saw from Terence Thiessen, who he said that a substance dualist, right? It's almost like they shouldn't go along with a lot of this, because he said this almost smacks of materialistic physicalism. He says that because the soul, right, is distinguished. So he doesn't think the brain and the mind are the same thing, right? And so when we say, well, you need to develop your cognitive faculties, he's like, but the soul and the mind could be doing things that you just don't know about. It could be responding to God in a way that you just don't know about, you can't perceive or whatever. That's interesting. And there are others there are books written on infant faith, where that definitely is a view that certain people have, is they'll say, well, maybe infants are capable of responding to the light that God has given them, and we're just not aware of what that light is. That just strikes me as bizarre. So, yes, I'm talking, when I say infant, I think it's important. Like when you said small children, perhaps we're thinking of two different things. When I'm thinking infant, if you're of the belief, for example, if you think that life begins at conception, what does it mean to say that they have implicit faith in certain Christian doctrines, right? Or that the fetus inside the mother, who's only not even maturely developed, that has implicit faith in the 8 propositions you'll find in Alyssa Childers' book by Norman Geisler. I don't know what that means, right? So there's another book that I can recommend. It's by Ronald Nash, and I think it's called, if I see it, When a Baby Dies, okay? Right, and so his idea is, how do you comfort a mother who is in a time of mourning? And he'll push back on a view like mine, because he'll say it doesn't provide any comfort, none at all, because the child, of course, when it has developed, can choose against God. There is always that chance, right? You could also get pushback from Roman Catholics, because they believe that that baptized babies, right? If you baptize a child and it dies shortly after, it goes straight to heaven. But what if something like the final option theory is true? Right, where the baptized baby, his soul is then awakened at the moment of death. Well, it could choose against God, right? So that's some pushback that people like Nash and others have offered. So yeah, there's a lot of pushback.
Well, so while we're speculating in speculation land, why don't we go ahead and speculate on another option that I've heard from people like Josh Rasmussen. He's suggested, I don't know if he actually holds this. He may actually hold it, I don't know. there's a view, I don't even know what to call it, pre-ensoulment option. Maybe that's, I don't know how to. So basically, the idea would be that before the person is ensouled into like a human body, they would be given the option. They just wouldn't remember that they were given the option, and they would be fully informed and all that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so
like,
I wrote
it's basically instead of putting it at the end, you put it at the beginning.
I wrote an entire paper. That's the paper that I sent to you. I wrote an entire paper on this that I intend on submitting to a journal. So I don't want to give too much away, or then people will know that I've written it, and that won't be good for peer review. Right. Is that a viable option? Well, again, you're going to have some Catholics going to point to certain ecumenical council to say, no, it's not. That smacks of Origenism, and that was condemned at this, right? And so it's just not going to be viable for that reason, because we have established conciliar statements that say that you cannot believe such a thing. Well, what if you're not a Catholic? Right? What can you do with something like this? Well, there are some people who they mistakenly conflate premortalism with reincarnation, right? Which is ridiculous, because reincarnation, of course, you're reincarnated, but they're not being reincarnated. This is prior to them first taking on their fleshly form, right? So is that viable? I mean, you'll find Cambridge Platonists who hold to something like this. You'll find there's probably the most living, prominent Eastern Orthodox theologian does hold to a view like this. I myself am dabbling with a view like this. Again, people would just have to wait to see the paper. One problem that comes with this, right? So if people are interested, James Spiegel has written an article that you can find in Springer Link that is on this very topic, and he addresses a lot of the concerns, but I don't think he addresses all of them that I might have for something like this. So you could have the idea that if God is a perfect being, then God doesn't want there to be involuntary suffering, which means suffering that the person who is undergoing has not themselves acknowledged or accepted for themselves, right? That happens without their permission. So we have a lot of this in our world, right? But even if God was to take drastic measures, it seems like he wouldn't remove all forms of involuntary suffering. So say, for example, some people have posited that maybe God could do all sorts of miraculous acts. Like if I had a gun and I pointed at somebody, God could make the gun fold into, I don't know, a banana or something so that it didn't fire a bullet. But that wouldn't remove all forms of involuntary suffering, because then I would know that this individual hated me, right? It wouldn't remove stuff like racism. You could still have people who are racist, and although they can't physically harm you with objects, they could still form unions where they keep you out of stores, where they don't invite you to parties. And I didn't choose, right, to experience racism. And so you still have that form. You'd have psychological and mental forms of suffering that you had not elected or chosen for yourself. But some people posit that, well, you can get past this if prior to being ensouled in a body, God gives you different various options of different worlds that you could inhabit. So God shows you maybe there's this world over here where you can only choose among certain goods, but you don't have significant freedom. And God gives you that option, okay? Well, then some people say, well, why on earth would anybody choose the option of experiencing significant freedom along with all these different forms of suffering, right? Why on earth would someone choose that? I'd say go read The Giver, right? You got to read fiction on this. Go read The Giver, go read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and go watch Pleasantville, where they kind of dabble with this theme. You'll hear from a lot of people who argue that heaven will be boring for precisely this reason, because a lot of these things that we think as bad actually give excitement to our lives. So you'll meet people, for example, who are in relationships where they say, I like a little drama to spice up my relationship, right? So you have people like that where if they're presented with, you can go to this world with your Prince Charming, he'll never do anything wrong, it's going to be all sunshine and roses. Or you could go to this world with this other guy who, he's got some drama. There'd be some people who I wouldn't be surprised if they chose that. Now, one of the big problems, though, is that of consent, right? In what sense are these individuals in a position where they consent to this? I don't think that's a big obstacle, because I think that perhaps God can simulate these experiences to the soul, right? So something like, if you've ever read The Giver, is you have the giver place his hands on the receiver, and he extends an experience and what the experience is like to the receiver, right? So whether it's of him going down a hill of snow, he puts his hand, and now the receiver, he gets what it's like to go down the hill without himself having gone down the hill. Maybe God could do something like that, because then, of course, there's the thing, before God ever created the world, did God himself know what it was like to experience these different forms of suffering, right? And the idea that some people have proposed is, well, maybe God could simulate the experience for himself prior to ever creating the world, and these people experiencing these different forms of suffering. So that's kind of how you could get around it, I guess. You could say that God could simulate these experiences, and once these people have experienced these simulated experiences, they could say, whoa, that sounds like an awful world. I don't want to go there. I mean, New Jersey exists in that world. That's a terrible thing, gratuitous evil. So they don't go to that world. Again, though, I think that is the best objection to an argument like that, to the premortalist view, is in what sense can these people be said to be in a place where they can give meaningful consent to something like that? That's probably the best objection.
Yeah, I don't think it's a really great objection. But I did want to remind you and the audience that Christians just don't think about stuff. They haven't been considering these issues very deeply. They don't have any responses. This kind of stuff. It's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah. The bookshelves at Princeton Theological Seminary's library are just empty. Just
empty. Completely empty. Yeah. Okay, we had another super chat come in. Let's get to this one from Joshua Wooden. This looks like a good question for you. Hey, Cameron, quick question. Universalism is like all is one and one is all right. Maybe English isn't their first language. I'm not sure. What exactly is universalism? That's a better question. And I see that Calvinism is heresy.
Wow.
Well, yeah.
So I'd say it's funny, the second remark, that Calvinism is heresy. A quote that always stayed with me was Andrew Louth, who's a really prominent Eastern theologian and patristic scholar, who he once in a book, it was called The Extent of the Atonement. It was like a 5-use book. He said that Calvinism is a freak in the Christian tradition, which I was like, well, that is rather insensitive to say to a Calvinist, but I understand where you're coming from. So that's all I'll say in that regards. Now, as far as what is universalism, I think Richard Bauckham said it best, he's not a universalist. All that universalism teaches is that eventually all will be saved. Okay, that's all. There are universalists who differ to a large extent on how that is actually accomplished. But I heard of one who wrote a book. It's called Once Loved, Always Loved. He's a great guy. So you might want to check out that book. But that's basically what universalism is not pluralism, okay? In fact, most universalists that I know of aren't pluralists. Pluralism is the idea that the major enduring religions, okay, that they go towards the same destination or they tend towards the same goal. So it's not even that all forms of religion, like somebody like John Hick isn't going to say that, oh yeah, those crazy people in Waco, Texas, right, that they're part of my pluralist vision, or that Heaven's Gateway cult, that they're part of my pluralistic vision. That is so false. The idea that you'll have from people like Marcus Borg and John Hick is that it's the enduring religions of the world that are involved in this pluralistic vision. The form of universalism that I hold to rejects that. So it just states that eventually all will be saved.
There you go, Joshua. Hopefully that was helpful. Okay, we're about to get to the part of the video that I find most interesting because he does attempt to do some philosophy here. So let's listen to what he has to say, why he thinks that people being born in heaven or going to heaven, children, infants, the unborn, why that's such a problem for Christian responses to the problem of evil. Here we go.
Leaving that aside, let's zoom in here. If it's fine for people to wake up in God's ever-loving presence without the opportunity to choose the worst kinds of evils imaginable or build their character in a place where people do, why is the world like this? It seems like Christians are overplaying their hand if their entire solution to the problem of suffering is to say that such opportunities are the greatest thing ever, and yet most people don't in fact get to have them. Put another way, if free will and soul building, in the kind of context we find ourselves in, are as valuable as people claimed, it would be surprising for a massive portion of heaven's population to essentially wake up there. Surprising for a loving God to withhold the opportunity for vast swaths of creatures to grow in extremely valuable ways. This would be exactly what we would expect, however, if it's not as valuable as claimed. Here's the problem. Those who doubt the reality of a perfectly loving God point out that this is not the kind of world we would expect such a being to create. One rejoinder is that free will and soul building in this kind of context represent extremely valuable ways for us to grow and flourish as as persons and are uniquely valuable out of all the ways we could have potentially done so. That is why God puts up with the worst kinds of evils imaginable. But if your own commitments entail, or at least strongly suggest, that free will and soul building aren't as valuable to God as you are claiming, then you've got a problem, because you're cutting off the branch you're sitting on when it comes to responding to the problem of evil.
There you have it. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, I have a lot.
Why don't you go first while I drink some fruit punch?
Okay. So yeah, this was the most interesting part of the video from my perspective as someone who's just like obsessed with philosophy and thinking about especially the problem of evil as well. I've put a lot of thinking into this argument. So I was talking actually with a philosopher friend of mine about this, and this is connected to that video that I was mentioning at the very beginning of the stream that's related to why didn't God just create everyone in heaven? And basically, one of the points that Dustin makes here is that if these goods of like soul building and free will and stuff are so valuable, then we should basically be seeing more people given the opportunity to exemplify those great goods. And the response that I think is plausible to this is basically that what God is looking for is a world that is the best, not necessarily a world that just has a certain type of goods in it, okay? The way that you sort of flesh this out actually is really helpful with some analogies. So suppose that someone is trying to build like the best possible Lego setup, okay? They're using Legos, they're trying to build the coolest or most beautiful or whatever Lego structure they're trying to build, okay? And suppose that of the types of Legos, the building pieces that you could use, there is like one that is like the best or the most valuable piece that you could have, okay? But if someone that's building like the most valuable Lego set, would they just use the pieces that are like the best pieces if they're building like the intuition that I have is that like, no, like you're going to build from pieces that are really good and you're going to use pieces that are just good. You're going to use pieces that you sort of need in order to build the structure that you need to build. And so a diversity is actually like there's good in diversity. So it doesn't just because something is valuable doesn't mean that you only have to use valuable things. There's another analogy that you could actually use to show this again is through like jewelry. Okay, what would be the most like beautiful, valuable piece of jewelry that you could put together? Would it just be like a big, massive diamond? Like well, just think about that. Like, Andrew, maybe I'll ask you the question. Like, do you think that like the most valuable piece of jewelry would just be diamonds, like diamond encrusted diamonds? Or would you think that it would be okay to use less valuable things like gold or rubies, you know, other things that are less valuable than diamonds? Or would you think that the most like beautiful piece of jewelry would have to be just diamonds, the most valuable thing that there is on the earth?
Well,
what are your intuitions?
Yeah, I go to a very liberal institution, so I feel like I need to say that I do see beauty in diversity. I have to say that, but I also mean, and I think you could say a couple other things in this regard. So some people, they often ask, if they say, okay, even if this is a sufficiently good world, but it could be better. But you could have someone like Thomas J. Ord, Thomas Talbot, and myself who believe that any world that is sufficiently good, that God actualizes that world. Okay? So any sufficiently good world, God actualize it. So we may not just be in the one that's better, but we are among those sufficiently good worlds that God actualized. Another approach that I was thinking of before you talked was diversity. So God has not just created rocks, but he created alligators, and he created humans, and he created angels, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
there's this hierarchy. So it could be that maybe God wants that too with human beings. He wants some who have significant freedom, some who have a different form of freedom, and on and on and on. So those are two different approaches, yeah.
Yeah, and it just the overall intuition I think that he's trying to like highlight here is that if these goods are so valuable, then they should just be ubiquitous. They should be everywhere. That should be basically the only thing that almost exists. But that just doesn't follow. Like it doesn't follow at all, right? Even if something is really good, it doesn't follow that the best world or the ensemble or like the conglomerate, the best like thing that you can build out of all of the like the array of goods that there are. Like you can, it's just very easy to imagine a best possible world, including all sorts of goods, the best goods, other goods that are just, still really good, but not as good as those other goods, but a world that is diverse, has a diversity of goods. Like, what is so wrong about that? Like, and if that's not wrong, then it doesn't follow. Like, the intuition that he's sort of getting at here just doesn't follow at all. So, and that's the type of world that God is interested in creating, is not just a world that has, the maximal amount of the most valuable goods exemplified. He's interested in the most, axiologically beautiful world that he can create. And what is that world actually going to look like? And that's something that you've got to actually think about, is what would that world actually look like? Would it just be a world full of creatures that are in heaven? Or would it be a world that's sort of like, diverse and mixed and have all sorts of different goods that are doing all sorts of different things in the world and all contribute in different ways to the overall goodness of the world itself? Again, think about these analogies. Like, I actually am into Legos at this point. I haven't built one in a while, but there was a period where I was into building Legos, and there are some pieces that are like cooler than others, but I wouldn't infer like, okay, this piece is really cool, so therefore like the best Lego set that you could build is just comprised of this one piece. Like that just doesn't make any sense. And so it just doesn't follow that the greatest, like if there is a set of greatest goods, then the world is only going to be situated in such a way that those greatest goods can obtain. So, but I think I've made that point sufficiently. So, do you have any other thoughts? Otherwise, we can actually kind of wrap up the stream here.
Sure. Yeah, a few things. So it's interesting. Yeah, some people play paintball and some people play with Legos. So hey, there's diversity. But I think you're right. I think that with sameness, there is the beauty of uniformity, right? But with diversity, there's the beauty of the contrast. So that's a big thing that if you look into early Christian history, that somebody like Augustine harped on, is the beauty of the contrast. And as somebody who appreciates art, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, there are many paintings that I look at, and they're even more beautiful because of the contrast, right? So maybe God prioritizes aesthetic goods among the other ones that he takes into consideration when actualizing a world. Now, as far as
there's just so many, sorry to kind of cut you off again, but there's so many different things that you could apply this reasoning to, and just see that diversity is just a really great good. Like, think about what the best possible car could be, right? And then think like, would the best possible world have only that type of car in it? Or would it contain, a whole diverse, like try to tell, what is his name? Jay Leno. Try to tell Jay Leno that like the best possible world is going to have one type of car, and it's just going to be the best possible car that could exist. And there's not going to be this diverse, set of different cars, some greater than others. To me, it's a very simplistic view. It's a very like, to kind of use some of his own phrasing, it's not a very well thought out view. Right. But yeah, sorry to cut you off. You can continue.
There's one individual once said that God has an how do you put it? An inordinate fondness for beetles, because there are tens of thousands of different types of beetles, right? I think this is actually really cool that God cares about something, even to the level of a beetle. God cares about something like diversity. And also, I love my fellow Italians. My fellow Italians are amazing, but I'm so glad that there are other people besides Italian. That's right. That was a microaggression. I'm gonna report YouTube on you.
Wait, no. What are you? Are you Italian?
Yeah, you got a problem with that? I gotta call my cousins?
What is no, dude? I'm Italian.
Oh, okay. Bertuzzi.
How do you not know that? Bertuzzi is like the most Italian name on the planet.
I was guessing either Italian or Polish, to be honest.
Bertucci.
Yeah.
Apparently that's the way you pronounce it. Italian. No, not at all. That's why I was confused. I guess we kind of do look a little similar.
Yes, just so the audience knows,
pale.
I wore this hat not to show off, but I wore this hat because Cameron usually wears a hat. So I'm like, now we'll match, and he threw me off. So
I do often wear hats.
He better do his penance later for that. But yeah, so a few final thoughts. So in this conversation, right, this is a really important conversation for many people who have lost their children, right? I mean, I know a lot of people in my church who've lost children. And there are certain passages that they'll point to, right? So you'll have passages like 2 Samuel 12:23, which is of King David describing the death of his son. And he says that I shall go to him. He talks about his son who has been struck down for David's sin with Bathsheba. Now, it's not as simple as just quoting that verse and saying, see, all infants are therefore saved. It's not that easy. I wish it was. The problem, well, there are many problems. One is that this child is the son of a member of the covenant community, that being Israel. And so you'll have certain individuals who think that only the children of those in the covenant community are saved. We'll cite this passage and say, this is evidence that those who die in infancy, who are children of the covenant community members, will be saved. But this is not evidence that anybody outside of that covenant community, that their children who die in infancy will be saved. And that's a good point. There are others who say that we're reading way too much into this passage. We're reading our more developed views of heaven and hell in the afterlife into this passage. But you can read a book like The Shades of Sheol, which takes a very different view than more so some fundamentalist circles who they do that with a lot of the passages that come prior to Isaiah or the book of Daniel, and they attempt to read what we find in the New Testament, in the book of Daniel, Isaiah, into these previous passages. So some say this might just be a way of David saying, one day I'm going to die. That's it. You'll find that view represented in John Sanders' work and Terence Tieson's work, where he says that might just be what it's saying, is that one day David will die. Or the other could be that this individual was a child of a covenant community member, and so covenant community members' children are good to go, but not the same is true for those who are outside the covenant community. So yeah, I don't think that's a great passage to cite. A more interesting one is when Jesus in the Synoptic Gospel says to let the little children come to him and do not forbid them, for to such is the kingdom of heaven, right? But again, there are people who say, well, it's deceiving because the children that are being described, they aren't infants, right? They seem to be of a more mature age. That's one view that's put forward. There are others who say, well, again, these are children of the covenant community. So these aren't children of those who are not members of the covenant community. So that's not evidence for that, the proposition that individuals outside the covenant community, that their infants, when they die, go to heaven. This is only evidence for the fact that individuals who are part of the covenant community, that their children who die in infancy will go to heaven. And then, of course, there's a third reading which says that Jesus he's saying that you have to become like these little children to enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's not necessarily saying that all children who die go to heaven, but that if you want to enter heaven, you have to become like these little children. So those are two prominent passages, and I will agree with particularly Reformed people, how they view those passages, that, yeah, I don't think there's a lot that you can take out of that will give you necessarily hope that those who are not part of the covenant community, that their children will be in heaven. I just think that's pretty convincing. Now, with Catholicism, it gets really interesting, because I remember thinking, when I started thinking about the baptism of desire, I started thinking, well, why can't this be extended to those who die in infancy as well? So there's interesting views on this, and they differ. So one is baptism of blood, which is usually it's reserved for martyrs, right? Those who die for the faith. Now, what do you do with an abortion, right? Could it be said to be a baptism of blood? Well, some people have suggested that, but then others have pushed back. Like I saw an episode with Jimmy Akin, which he said, no, that doesn't count as a baptism of blood, right? They're not a martyr in that case. But then others have said, well, maybe there's a baptism of desire on the part of the parents and the church itself, right? And that extends to the infant. I'm not sure. Some have proposed that. Maybe that's something other Catholics can look into. But so those are...
that is a view that you mentioned Jimmy Akin. That is a view that he's expressed. So I don't know if it was in the same video that you watched, perhaps. But,
I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's good to know. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much it. So I was looking at the live chat. Some people were talking about Legos and stuff, and then someone was talking about the total number of ants that there are. You were talking about beetles, like the different types of beetles. Yeah. There's 100 trillion ants in the world, apparently. Someone else said here. Actually, let me put this on the screen. One of our moderators put this in the live chat. She said, biologists specializing in studying ants have calculated that there are around 20 quadrillion ants worldwide.
I am fine with that as long as they stay out of my stinking kitchen. We're all good.
Oh, seriously. For that matter, beetles as well. Ugh. Or like roaches, or yeah.
Yes,
All right.
you're describing my sister's apartment right now.
Oh gosh.
Yes, I hope she's not listening, but
Okay. Ugh. Well, Andrew, it's great to have you back on the show. Maybe we can do something again in the future. Something pops up, just let me know.
Yeah, and to those who are listening, I wanted to let you know that in January I will be having a debate on my book on Premier Unbelievable. Sean McDowell was hosting, so I'm very pumped for that. So just be on the lookout for that.
Oh, nice. So he's hosting it on Unbelievable?
Yeah.
How's that working? Okay, interesting.
Because we were supposed to have it in October, but I don't know if you know, but he got really sick, so we had to keep on postponing it.
Yeah. Well, who are you debating?
That's a good question. I just blanked out on his name. It's on his book, The Skeletons in God's Closet. And I know his name has something to do with Joshua. But yeah, look at that. I can remember all those dead theologians, but I can't remember a living one. What was his name?
So sad.
Oh, well.
So sad. So sad. Yeah. No, but yeah, great show. Thought we were able to cover some really interesting stuff today. So appreciate you putting in the work to do this, but appreciate you guys watching. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video. We've got some really, how do I even put this? We've got some really exciting content that's coming out very soon on the channel, especially around Christmas time. We're going to be posting a trailer for something that's coming out very soon. So get excited. It's going to be a really awesome time for the channel.
Joshua Butler. Remember that. Joshua Butler.
Joshua Butler. Okay. Debating Joshua Butler on Unbelievable. When did you say? January?
January 12th is when we record. I don't know when it releases.
But it'll be up sometime soon after that. Cool. Awesome. All right, Andrew. I'll check you later. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. See you in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?